We are going to undertake in this class for the next few weeks, and I don't know how many weeks. Uh, just don't know, but we'll have to see how we progress as we go along. We're going to be in the book of Romans. Um, and why study the book of Romans? Well, I'm going to read something here. Romans is Paul's greatest work. It's placed first among his 13 epistles in the New Testament. While the four Gospels present the words and works of Jesus Christ, Romans explores the significance of his sacrificial death. Using a question and answer format, Paul records the most systematic presentation of doctrine in the Bible. Romans is more than a book of theology. It's also a book of practical exhortation. The good news of Jesus Christ is more than facts to be believed. It's also a life to be lived, a life of righteousness befitting the person, justified freely by God's grace through the redemption that is in Christ Jesus. Romans is it's a great book. Some other things that's been said about Romans, and I don't remember where I read this particular one. Now, I started preparation for this class several months ago, but I read that someone said if we have the New Testament now, if all the books of the New Testament were taken away except one, which one would it be that we'd want to have? And he said it'd be the book of Romans because of all that's contained therein about doctrine and things like that, and theology. You have Romans, you could deal with the Christian life. What do you say? Now, I suppose that's certainly true, but that was pretty interesting. One person says it's for the Christian faith, the book of Romans is the Declaration of Independence, Constitution, and the Bill of Rights, all over the world. A lot of things there, everything there that we need. And it's Paul's masterpiece. It's God's legal document and the believer's title deed. Romans tells us what to believe and how to behave. The first part of the book is kind of a doctrine of theology. The last chapter is practical things for us. Romans 8, chapter 8, is considered by many to be the most profound and precious chapter in the New Testament. And we'll spend quite a bit of time on Romans 8 when we get to that part. I have a little book, the whole book on Romans chapter 8. Great chapter in the Bible and the New Testament, in the book of Romans. All right, we need some, I think, introduction tonight before we get into the text. We need to talk about why the book was written, who it was written, and who wrote it. Now, first, go ahead and turn to Romans chapter 1. I assume you'll turn there anyway. Tell us that the very first word who wrote it, it was Paul, and it was Paul. We'll talk about Paul a little bit. I'm going to lay this down for a second.
Your mic is good for you. Your mic is good for you sometimes. Okay,
Is it okay?
You can't hear me. Okay. It may have just turned itself off. Just put it in your pocket, okay? Put it in your
Put
pocket.
it in my pocket.
Yeah, let's try that. Just look there and make sure the light stays on green.
All right.
Every now and then. Kevin's just okay. Kevin's listening to it.
Okay. What is our first encounter with Paul, who was originally called, what was his name? Saul. And we're talking about that. We're not talking about that. Saul was his Jewish name. Saul was a Roman citizen. I suppose his father was a Roman citizen, and Paul was kind of born into it. He had never been to Rome. He was from Tarsus. Tarsus was a part of the Roman Empire, which is very big. Something I read just today that Roman people had three names: first name, a middle name, and a last name. You have to go off. Sometimes you go forward. My middle name is Ray, nobody calls me Ray. But it's, most of us probably have three names. That's a tradition still carried forward. Saul was his Jewish name, and Paul was his Roman name. Paul was his Roman name, and I will talk a little bit later about why that he, maybe why they decided to use the name Paul instead of Saul. There's a reason for that. But the reason is not because God changed his name from Saul to Paul. You can't put that in the Word of God. I'll turn over to Acts chapter 8. Let me get this back on here. We need a new battery. All right. Well, I need a new battery myself, so it makes us even. Acts chapter 8. We're going to see who this Saul fellow was. We're going to talk about that for a while, because we need to know that. Since he wrote the book, let's learn something a little bit about him. Chapter 7 in the books of Acts tells us about the sermon that Stephen gave, and how that the people were very upset with Stephen because he said he saw Jesus at the right hand of God. They didn't like that. And what did they do to him in verse 59 or verse 57 of Acts chapter 7? They cried out with a loud voice, stopped their ears, and ran at him with one accord. They cast him out of the city and stoned him. And the witnesses laid down their clothes at the feet of a young man named Saul. And they stoned Stephen as he was calling on God and saying, Lord Jesus, receive my spirit. Okay, and then, so Stephen is called the first Christian martyr. A young man named Saul was there. And Saul agreed with the verdict of stoning Stephen. He was consenting into his death. Chapter 8, verse 1. All right. Well, so who was this fellow named Saul? Well, if he lived today, he would be called a militant right winger. He was zealous for God, zealous for the law, the Torah, and he felt that he had the duty and the right to put that zeal into operation with the use of violence if necessary. That's how strongly he felt about it. He was a Pharisee, and there were some very extreme Pharisees who felt that they could do anything in order to keep Jews in line. That's what it was. Now, why did they think that? Well, the extreme right-wing Pharisees, their idea, we're going to defeat the pagans. Who's the pagans? That's Rome. We're going to defeat them, and we're going to bring in these renegade Jews that we brought into line, or they'd be destroyed. So you call them religious zealots or fanatics or whatever you want to call them. We've still got those in the world today who basically say, if you don't agree with me, then I have a right to exercise violence upon your body if you don't agree with me. What was his agenda? 3 things. He was zealous for Israel's God and the Torah, or the law, had a personal piety for God. He had a zeal for the Torah, a desire to see God honored, which necessitated the stamping out all forms of disloyalty to the Torah among Jews. Now, what did the Christians, they've come up with a new system, haven't they? You got to keep this in mind. Keep in mind the context of the time that we're talking about. Jews were expecting the coming of Messiah, that something was going to happen, something great was going to happen, and the kingdom was going to be restored to them. Instead of them being down on the bottom rail, they was going to be on the top rail. They were going to be back in prominence again. They were looking for that. They were waiting for that. And they felt that, or I'll read this, Saul intended that he and others would keep the Torah so wholeheartedly in the present that they would be marked as already as those who would be vindicated on the great coming day when Jehovah finally acted to save and redeem his people. And he intended to hasten this day by forcing other Jews to keep the Torah in his way, using violence as and when necessary. So that was Saul's agenda. We're going to keep Jews in line. The Christians were not Jews in line. They were way out of line because now they were saying, oh, you don't have to go to the temple anymore. We've got this new system. We're following Christ. Well, Saul, being from Tarsus, he was not in Jerusalem when all the events around Christ's life, but he had heard about them. And chapter 8, which I think that's the right place. All right. How about reading the first 3 verses there, Ben? You want to read that for us?
Therefore, there is now no condemnation.
No, Acts.
Acts, okay, I thought you
Acts chapter 8.
Saul wholeheartedly approved of Stephen's death. And on that day, a great relentless persecution broke out against the church in Jerusalem. And the believers were all scattered throughout the regions of Judea and Samaria, except for the apostles. Some devout men buried Stephen and mourned greatly over him. But Saul began ravaging the church and assaulting believers, entering the house after house, and dragging off men and women, putting them in prison.
Now, this is the fellow Saul we're talking about. Verse 3, he went in people's houses and just drug them out of their house and took them to prison And the charge against them, well, you're not following the law anymore. Now, the Romans were in charge, but they gave the Jews had a lot of latitude about the Jewish religion. They pretty well left them alone there. Stephen was stoned. That was a capital offense. But the Romans allowed the Jews to carry out stoning. Now, crucifixion had to be done by the Romans, I suppose. But Jews could stone people that they felt were not following the law. All right, now let's go right over to chapter 9. We're going to read some more about Saul. Who would like to read verses? Well, just first two verses.
Saul, still breathing threats and murder against the disciples of the Lord, went to the high priest and asked letters from him to the synagogues of Damascus, so that if he found any who were of the way, whether men or women, he might bring them bound to Jerusalem.
All right. It wasn't enough for Saul to just try to get people there in Jerusalem, but he said he was going to go to Damascus, which was in Syria. That was way north of Jerusalem. He's going to go there and find people who were members of the church, or the ones that were called the Way, and he was going to bring them back to Jerusalem and put them in prison. He had to go to the chief priest. He said he went to the chief priest and got letters which authorized him to do that. So this is the kind of fellow that Saul was. He was a religious zealot. Now, I heard from this pulpit right here, not by Daniel either, but I heard statement made that Saul was a bad man. I don't agree that he was a bad man. Paul said himself he'd lived in good conscience before God until this day. He was trying to do what he thought was right. And the sermon that I heard, he talked about Jeffrey Dahmer, who was a bad man, and then talked about Saul or Paul being bad. I don't think Paul was bad. He was misinformed, but he had he was trying to do the right thing. But he needed a change in direction. And that's what I'm going to read to you right now. I'm going to read from this.
Mike, I don't know if I agree with that comment, because God never, I don't think God ever wants us to pursue our religious zealotry. In fact, we kill somebody. It's okay for me. It's like a Muslim. If they believe in the Muslim way, they have no right. I think that's evil when they pursue people and chop people's heads off to kill people because you don't agree with us. The Mormons have done stuff like that. Churches of Christ have run a lot of people off because of their religious zealotry. You either get in the program or hit the road. And I think that comes from an evil spirit and an evil heart. And I think that you should know that. We are the priests of Jesus Christ and love, okay?
Yeah.
And people either accept it or reject it. Jesus Christ preached in love all the time. He went about doing good. He did nothing but good. But the people still, they got him killed because of that.
Yeah.
Okay? So we can do more damage with our zealotry if we're not careful than we can with our kindness, So I think, I don't know, if I went into somebody's house and started dragging out women and men and their kids are crying and screaming, playing that mom, and knowing full well, I may take these people to their death. I think you have to have a little bit. That's over the top. I mean, that's over the top.
I think you got to look at it in context. Back then, that was normal. That was what you did. I mean, God would have you go in and wipe out entire cities because he knew the cancer would spread. He knew the thing.
Yeah.
The zealous, that much zealous was.
That's right. That's what the zealots did, and they were extremists, yes. They were religious extremists. Saul wasn't the only one that felt this way, because that right wing of the Pharisees, that's what they wanted to do. With Stephen, he preached. He didn't like what he preached, so away with you, done away with him.
I wouldn't agree with that anyway, shape or form nowadays, but looking back on them in them days, I can see why Paul felt like he had the right to do
Yeah,
it.
he felt like he had the right to do it. Now that's
Good intention, but evil.
Joanne.
I think you have to look at Paul or Saul. I think you have to look at what his motivation was. You know, today we're not taught, people aren't taught, and as a result of not being taught, they have a negative opinion of religion because they haven't ever been taught that religion is a good thing. Paul had never been taught how to do the right thing. And as somebody up front said, it was a custom of the time that if you didn't agree, you know, God sent people in and destroyed whole cities, men, women, children, the whole 9 yards. Paul was a good man because he did everything with a clear conscience. He wasn't doing it out of evil. He was doing it with a clear conscience because he thought he was doing the right thing. Yeah, that's the case. Because 3,000 people in Alabama counties, tens of thousands, not hundreds of thousands of people, they're doing it with clear conscience. They think they're right.
Yeah.
So I think he was a bad person. And I think that's why he said he was Jesus. And even maybe if they got, and I do believe he thought he was doing the right thing, but I just don't think that negates the fact that he was very
Well, okay, that's who Saul was. Now, that's the kind of character he was. But he was a zealous person. But he got turned around, didn't he? And in a big way. And I definitely want to think I'll just read this from this New Testament for everyone, from Acts chapter 9. Meanwhile, Saul was still breathing out threats and murder on the Lord's disciples. He went to the high priest and requested from him official letters to the synagogues in Damascus so that he could find people who belonged to the way, men and women alike, tie them up and bring them back to Jerusalem. While he was on the journey and was getting near to Damascus, suddenly a light from heaven shone around him. He fell on the ground and heard a voice speaking to him. "Saul, Saul," said the voice, "why are you persecuting me?" "Who are you, Lord?" he asked. "I am Jesus, and you are persecuting me. But get up and go into the city, and it will be told you what you have to do." The men who were traveling with Paul stood speechless. They heard the voice but couldn't see anybody. Saul got up from the ground, but when he opened his eyes, he couldn't see anything. So they led him by the hand and brought him to Damascus. He went for 3 days being unable to see, and he neither ate nor drank. In Damascus, there was a disciple named Ananias. The Lord spoke to him in a vision. "Ananias," he said. "Here am I, Lord." "Get up," said the Lord to him, "and go to the street called Straight. Inquire at the house of Judas for a man from Tarsus named Saul. Look, he is praying, and he has seen in a vision a man named Ananias coming and laying his hands on him so that he can see again." "Well, Lord," replied Ananias, "I've heard about this man from several people, about how he's done wicked things to your holy people in Jerusalem. And now he's come here with authority from the chief priest to tie up everybody who calls on your name." "Just go," replied the Lord. "He's a chosen vessel for me to carry my name before nations and kings and the children of Israel too. I'm going to show him how many things he's going to have to suffer for the sake of my name." So Ananias set off, went into the house, and laid his hands on him. Brother Saul, he said, the Lord has sent me, yes, Jesus, who appeared to you on the road as you were coming here, so that you may be able to see again and receive the Holy Spirit. At once something like scales fell off his eyes. He was able to see. He got up and was baptized. He had something to eat and regained his strength. And then he went from that, and instead of trying to persecute people in the church, he went to started preaching for the church and turned completely around. And this was Saul's conversion on the road to Damascus. Do you think it took something like that to turn Saul around? I think so. I think so. Yeah. He, imagine yourself if you were Saul and you're determined to do harm to the church, and all of a sudden, on the road to Damascus, a bright light appears from the heaven. You hear the voice of Jesus. You fall to the ground, and when you get up, you can't see. You're blind. Does that make an effect on somebody, you think? That's what it took to turn him around from being a persecutor of the church to being probably the most effective evangelist that the early church had with all the churches that he started. Mm-hmm.
That when he was converted, he was really converted. He saw how bad the error was in his belief that he was doing things right.
Yeah.
But I think all that preceded him had to have happened for him to himself.
Right.
I think too, God knew if he worked that hard at them and walking on because he thought it was right, that he would work that hard at the right things.
Mm-hmm.
God knew what he did. I remember that when they look back and they talk about the alarm sound, the first man to walk on the moon. They said that the mission was filled with anxiety and worry, but they said they kept reminding themselves, we've got the best pilot in the world to bring in this little body. So that's what the NASA thought. We've got the best pilot in the world, and he did. He landed. He talked about it also. Well, that never been done in the history of the world. God knew, I've got the best man in the world for this job right here. Now, he's on the wrong side. I got to get it from my side. I've got the best man in the whole world for this job. And of course, God was always right. And he was exactly right. All the time. Like you said, since Jesus.
Let's hear somebody turn and read Philippians 3, verse 6. And someone else find Galatians chapter 1. And we're going to read from verse 11 down to about 14 or 15. And 1 Corinthians chapter 15 and verse 9. Somebody find that one. I want to look at those particular verses before we move on.
Philippians 3:6, concerning zeal, persecution of the church, concerning the righteous, which is in the law of life.
All right. This is Paul talking about himself. To go back to verse 4, he said, although I also might have confidence in the flesh, if anyone thinks he may have confidence in the flesh, that's talking about being a Jew. He was circumcised the 8th day, the stock of Israel, the tribe of Benjamin, a Hebrew of the Hebrews, concerning the law, a Pharisee, concerning zeal, persecuting the church, concerning the righteousness, which is the law, blameless. So, Paul admitted, man, I was a bad fellow. Another verse, he said he was a blasphemer, a persecutor, and an insolent fella. So he's looking back at himself and seeing the way that he was. But now, of course, after conversion, he's turned 100% around. I mean, the gospel is powerful, is it not? And Paul said that he was, well, let's read further from Galatians here. Who has Galatians chapter 1? Start with verse 11. Who wants to read that?
But I make known to you, brethren, that the gospel which was preached by me is not according to man. For I neither received it from man, nor was I taught it, but it came through the revelation of Jesus Christ. That's what you want me to read?
Read down through verse 15.
For I have heard of my former conduct in Judaism, how I persecuted the church of God beyond measure, and tried to destroy it. And I advanced in Judaism beyond many of my contemporaries in my own nation, being more exceedingly zealous for the traditions of my father. For when it pleased God, who separated me from my mother's womb and called me through his grace, to reveal his Son in me, that I might preach him among the Gentiles. I did not immediately confer with flesh and blood, nor did I go up to Jerusalem to those who were apostles before me, but I went to Arabia and returned again to Damascus.
That's enough, okay. It's interesting to see from verse 15 that Paul considered that he had been separated for the work that he was going to do from his mother's womb. Like this was planned for me all along. But I went my own way. I was zealous for God. I did what I thought was right to keep people in line, to keep them obeying the law, keep Jews in line. I thought I was doing the right thing. Turned out I wasn't. I became a persecutor of the church.
Proverbs 14:12 says, "The way to see the fathers of man, and all the ways of death, seems strong on the one." But I think it took all that wrongness and all that stubbornness and that zealousy he had to make him the great interest that he was.
Okay, so that's enough about Saul. We see, and in Acts, I believe it's, I forget exactly where it was, he started calling himself Paul. And I think the reason for that was because, Paul started preaching out to the Jews, and their response, a lot of them, they didn't want anything to do with him. And he said, I'm going to the Gentiles and preach. So he became the apostle, the evangelist to Gentile people, the non-Jewish people in the world, is who he was going to. And but he said that he'd been separated from his mother's womb to be able to do this work. And that brings us to Romans. Talk about Romans here for a minute.
I would think too that maybe part of the name change too was to get away from the reputation that he had as Saul and kind of start afresh. Everybody knew about Saul, but maybe they didn't know about Paul.
Yeah. Paul in his epistles referred to himself as Paul, not Saul. I think that the reason behind that is, he think he'd have more influence with people by calling himself Paul, which was a Roman name, rather than Saul, which was a Jewish name. Because didn't Paul say that he was willing to become all things to all people in order that he might save some? And so maybe that's why the name has changed. All right.
Chapter 17 of Acts, where it says, verse 9, then Saul, who is also called the Holy Spirit, and yet, from that
the book. Now let's look at the book of Romans, and this is getting us in the next 2 or 3 minutes. This is getting to where I want to end, because this first lesson is going to be an introduction. Next week, we will take up the text of Romans. Romans was written approximately AD 57 from Corinth on Paul's third missionary journey. He was living in the house of Gaius. Now, from 47 to 57, Paul had spent evangelizing the territories east and west of the Aegean Sea. He concentrated on Roman provinces of Galatia, Macedonia, Achaia, and Asia. But he spent the winter of AD 56 and 57 in Corinth, staying at the home of Gaius. Now, his next, from there, he was going back to Jerusalem because, remember, he was out raising money for the poor saints in Jerusalem. He was going to take that back, and then he wanted to go to Rome after that. And so he wrote to the Romans and said, I want to come there. I want to go to Spain, but I want to come to Rome first. As far as we know, Paul, even though he was a Roman citizen, had never been to Rome. Rome was a city of some estimates are 1 million people. And the church might have been very small there in number. But Paul wanted to go through there. And Paul knew several Christians that he had met out on his journeys that lived in Rome. There were 2 times in AD 19, the Jews of Rome were expelled from the city by Tiberius, but they were brought back in a few years. In AD 49, which is just before this, 8 years before this letter was written, the Jews were expelled from Rome again and charged with rioting. That was under the Emperor Claudius. They were allowed to come back after the death of Emperor Claudius. The Jews had a rough time. The Romans really looked down on them. We see a lot of anti-Semitism in the world today, don't we? Seems people are against the Jews. Well, they were against the Jews back then too. Maybe because of their religion or whatever. But the Romans, as a class of people, I read that they looked down on Jewish people. And if anything went wrong, blame the Jews. Get rid of them. They had to leave, but they were allowed to come back. The original group of believers in Rome consisted predominantly of Jewish Christians. Aquila and Priscilla were from Rome. But by the time AD 57, Gentile members were probably in the majority. So you've got a church in Rome that's made up, say they're made up equal number of Gentiles and Jews trying to worship together. And maybe years ago they had not gotten along too well. So you can see some of the things that might come up here. But Paul wanted to go to Rome before he went to Spain. Now, he didn't get to Rome the way that he wanted to. When he went back to Jerusalem with this money, there was trouble with the Jews there, and he was arrested. And finally, he appealed to Caesar. And when he appealed to Caesar, then he got sent to Rome, and he got to Rome that way, not the way that he really wanted to. But so that brings us to the end of the lesson tonight. And now, next week, bring a good Bible that you like to read, because we're going to get into the text and see what did book of Romans say to the people then, and what does it say to us today.